corridor had not heard a scream in over a century. Stone remembers silence. It absorbs it, protects it. In the eastern wing of the palace, where portraits of monarchs watched with painted restraint and chandeliers hummed above polished marble, nothing ever broke formation. Not footsteps, not voices, not discipline. Until that night, at precisely 2140, a sound pierced through 3 layers of oak and centuries of protocol. It hurts. Please stop. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the unmistakable fracture of a child in distress. Outside the sealed chamber stood a royal guard trained to remain immovable, a living monument to obedience. His orders were clear. Hold position. Question nothing. Protect the crown by preserving order. But what happens when order itself becomes a question? In institutions built on hierarchy, hesitation can be treason. Intervention can end careers. And silence can protect more than reputation. As his gloved hand hovered inches from the door, the guard faced a choice no training manual prepares you for: obedience to rank or protection of innocence. What he did next would echo far beyond that corridor. The corridor had been silent for centuries, not the silence of emptiness, but the cultivated silence of power, the kind that lives in stone, breathes through velvet curtains, and settles permanently into marble floors polished by generations of careful footsteps. In the eastern wing of the palace, nothing ever startled the air. Portraits of monarchs lined the walls in gilded frames, their painted eyes steady and unblinking. Chandeliers glowed in restrained amber, their crystals trembling only when permitted by passing motion. Even the clocks ticked with discipline, never hurried, never loud. At precisely 2140 hours, Sergeant Elias Rowe adjusted his stance by less than a fraction of an inch. It was not visible to the untrained eye, but within the guard, posture was language. Precision was heritage. For 3 hours and 12 minutes, he had stood outside the rosewood antechamber, a private chamber reserved for family consultation and instruction. His boots aligned with the seam in the marble floor, his shoulders square to the door. His ceremonial tunic, midnight blue with silver braid, immaculate beneath the corridor's low light. He was not decoration. He was continuity. Inside that chamber was Princess Charlotte of Avamere, 8 years old, third in line to a constitutional throne sustained not by force, but by restraint. Protocol governed everything. When she met tutors, the door remained sealed. When family counsel was given, privacy was absolute. When a royal guard was assigned to a corridor, he did not move, not without signal, not without order, not without cause. The scream did not belong there. It hurts. Please stop. It was not loud. It did not echo, but it cut through oak, through insulation, through centuries of disciplined quiet. Rowe did not move. Training activated before emotion. He replayed the sound internally, separating tone from panic. Children protested lessons. Children resisted correction. Children dramatized discomfort. But that voice had not dramatized. It had fractured. A tremor lived inside it, the involuntary tremor of fear. The corridor seemed to contract. For a moment, the air itself felt thinner. Then silence returned. Heavy, deliberate, as if the palace were testing whether he would pretend he had heard nothing. Rowe's breathing remained steady, his eyes forward, his gloved hands still at his sides. Inside the chamber, present according to evening briefing, a senior household authority and the princess's private tutor, both credentialed, both cleared, both operating within approved hours. Rank mattered here. Hierarchy was not merely structure, it was protection against chaos. To question it without proof was to fracture stability. Another sound, quieter this time, a sob, abruptly suppressed. Rowe's jaw tightened. Children cry. Yes, but children do not whisper please in that tone unless pain is immediate. He felt it then, not panic, but recognition. He had a daughter, 6 years old. He knew the difference between frustration and fear. A faint scrape sounded from inside, something shifting, a chair leg against carpet. Then an adult voice, low, controlled. We are not finished. Not shouted, measured, authoritative. The corridor returned to stillness. Protocol sequence activated in his mind. Awaits secondary confirmation. Do not breach without clearance. Initiate coded status. Check only if structural threat is confirmed. There had been no fire alarm, no security breach alert, no signal from inside, only a child's voice. And that was not, technically, grounds for intervention. His earpiece crackled faintly. Routine channel traffic elsewhere in the palace. Nothing abnormal. Minutes passed, or perhaps seconds. Time lost shape. Rose shifted his attention to the brass panel beside the door, a discrete intercom linked to the chamber interior. Activation would be logged, reviewed, questioned. He imagined tomorrow's inquiry. Sergeant Rowe, on what authority did you disrupt private royal proceedings? Authority. The word pressed heavier than armor. Inside the chamber, a muffled cry. Short. Cut off. That was enough. He pressed the panel. A soft chime echoed inside. Silence. Then the tutor's voice, smooth and controlled. Yes. Routine corridor verification. Rowe replied, voice neutral. Status confirmation requested. A pause. Longer than protocol required. We require no assistance. Behind that sentence, faint, almost swallowed, a child's uneven breathing. Rowe did not immediately release the panel. Understood, he said, but his thumb remained against the brass surface for half a second longer than procedure allowed. And in that half second, he heard it. A whisper. Please. The intercom disconnected. The line went dead. Now the silence was no longer neutral. It was deliberate. Rowe returned his hand to his side. His stance perfect. But inside, something had shifted. The palace around him stood immaculate. Chandeliers suspended like frozen constellations. Carpet embroidered with dynastic emblems. Air scented faintly of wax and old paper. This institution had survived revolutions by mastering restraint. Because its guardians obeyed. Because its guards did not act on impulse. Yet obedience without conscience was not loyalty. It was surrender. Another sound from within. A sharp cry. Short. Followed by something falling. Rowe's pulse sharpened. He activated silent escalation on his wrist console. A discreet alert routed to Captain Merrow at Corridor Command. Response time, estimated 7 minutes. 7 minutes could be nothing. 7 minutes could be everything. Inside the chamber, movement intensified. A chair overturned fully this time. Fabric rustled sharply. No, please. That was not misinterpretation. That was distress. Rowe stepped forward. The door was electronically locked. Override required senior code, unless emergency breach protocol was invoked. Emergency breach protocol was reserved for fire or visible threat. Was this visible? No. Was it threat? His hand moved to the ceremonial breach, key secure at his belt. A symbol more than a tool. Polished brass. Rarely used. To insert it without authorization would trigger automatic review. Suspension likely. Dismissal possible. He inhaled once. Slow. Measured. The oath returned to him unbidden. I serve the crown that it may serve the people. The crown was not wood and jewel. It was promise. And the child behind that door represented the future of that promise. A final cry from within. Raw. Unfiltered. Rowe inserted the key. Turned. The lock resisted. Then yielded. The click echoed down the corridor like distant thunder. He opened the door. Not violently, but without hesitation. Light spilled into the corridor. Warmer, disordered. The camera does not linger. Only fragments register. A desk lamp knocked sideways. A chair on its side. Princess Charlotte on the carpet, tear-streaked, clutching her arm. An adult figure stepping back in shock. Sergeant, the tutor snapped. You are out of line. Rowe crossed the threshold fully. The line had already been crossed. The child looked up. Her eyes were not theatrical. They were searching. And when they landed on him, relief, immediate, unmistakable. Behind him, footsteps pounded down the corridor. Captain Merrow's voice, sharp and commanding. Stand down. Sergeant Rowe, explain yourself. But the explanation was already written in the room. Rowe knelt beside the princess, careful, controlled. Your Highness, he said quietly, are you harmed? She swallowed, nodding faintly. still hold her arm. The tutor's composure faltered for the first time. "This is an outrageous breach of protocol," he insisted. "Private instruction was in progress." Rose's voice remained calm. "I heard distress." "You heard resistance," the tutor replied sharply. Captain Merrow entered, eyes scanning the scene with trained calculation. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of centuries pressed into that chamber. Because something irreversible had occurred. Not necessarily in action, but in precedent. Roe had chosen conscience over hierarchy. And once that choice was visible, it could not be unseen. The princess's breathing slowed gradually. Medical staff were summoned. Formalities began. But the true fracture was not in the overturned chair. It was in the realization that silence had limits. Captain Merrow's gaze met Rose. There would be consequences. There always were. Yet as attendants guided the child gently from the chamber, she glanced back once. Not at rank, not at reprimand, at him. And in that glance was a question no protocol could answer. Who protects a protector when power forgets itself? The corridor outside filled with controlled urgency. Orders given. Logs initiated. Statements prepared. But beneath the administrative response, a deeper tremor had begun. Because if one guard could break formation for a child's cry, what else within these walls required re-examination? Rose stood once more in the corridor. Not dismissed yet. Not absolved. The portraits on the wall watched silently, as they always had. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was no longer unquestioned. And somewhere beyond the sealed chamber doors, forces larger than a single guard were already calculating how this breach would ripple through the institution. The corridor was silent again, but it was no longer innocent. By dawn, the eastern wing of the palace had resumed its immaculate composure. Carpets realigned, the overturned chair restored, brass polished to erase the impression of interruption. Servants moved with customary restraint. Footsteps softened against wool. Morning light filtered through tall, arched windows, dissolving the previous night into something almost theoretical. Almost. But silence, once broken, does not return unchanged. Sergeant Elias Rose stood in a different corridor now. Not ceremonial, not gilded. Administrative. Narrower. Functional. The kind of hallway where decisions were filed rather than displayed. He had not slept. At 2:10 hours, he submitted a formal incident report. At 2:17, Captain Merrow countersigned it with visible hesitation. At 3 o'clock, the Rosewood Antechamber's access logs were sealed under Tier 3 review. And by sunrise, the palace machine had begun its quiet assessment, because what occurred the night before was not simply a breach of protocol. It was a breach of narrative. The monarchy of Avamere survived not because it was flawless, but because it was disciplined in its internal order. The public saw ceremony, continuity, stability. But beneath the polished exterior existed a complex architecture of codes, hierarchies, and compartmentalized authority. Every corridor was monitored, every door logged, every visitor coded into layered clearance systems. Princess Charlotte's movements were among the most carefully protected within the palace. Her safeguarding protocols were rigid. No unscheduled visitors. No deviation from recorded instruction times. No private consultations without dual notification oversight. And yet last night, something had felt unstructured. As investigators from internal security entered the administrative wing, the tone was neither accusatory nor sympathetic. It was procedural. Procedure was the monarchy's preferred language. Rose sat across from Deputy Marshal Hallberg, a man whose calm expression rarely betrayed alignment. State again, Hallberg began evenly, the basis upon which you initiated emergency breach. Rose's posture remained formal, but his voice held quiet steel. I heard sustained distress from Her Highness, verbal indicators of pain, repeated pleas to cease. Hallberg's pen paused slightly. Did you witness physical threat prior to breach? No, sir. Then your action was based on interpretation. It was based on duty. A silence followed, not hostile. Measuring. Hallberg closed the file slowly. You understand, he said, that within private royal chambers, emotional expression is not unusual. Yes, sir. And that authority present inside that room outranked you. Yes, sir. And yet you intervened. Yes. Not defiant, not apologetic, simply factual. Across the palace, a separate team examined the Rosewood Antechamber's digital access ledger. The palace used a tiered override system. Standard locks required dual authentication from assigned personnel. Emergency breach keys activated a secondary log marker, but there was something else embedded in the data. At 21:34 hours, 6 minutes before the first scream, a temporary privacy override had been applied to the chamber. Not unusual in itself. Senior household members could authorize temporary isolation to prevent corridor interruptions during sensitive discussions. But this override had bypassed the standard dual notification alert. It had been manually suppressed. The technician, reviewing the code, leaned closer to the monitor. Suppress alerts required Tier 4 authorization. Very few individuals carried Tier 4 credentials, and none had been listed in the evening's public schedule for that wing. Meanwhile, Princess Charlotte had been relocated overnight to a separate suite under medical observation, officially for minor strain during instructional exercise. Medical staff had documented superficial redness along her forearm. No fractures, no lasting injury. But documentation was not conclusion. It was containment. The tutor present in the chamber had submitted his own statement by 4:20 hours. He described the incident as a disciplinary correction misinterpreted by overzealous security. He referenced established educational firmness, emotional resistance from the princess, no excessive force. His language was careful, too careful. By mid-morning, Captain Merrill was summoned to Household Council, a private chamber where institutional optics were weighed alongside operational facts. The monarchy's survival depended not on absence of conflict, but on management of it. Inside the council room, portraits gave way to maps. Legal frameworks replaced ceremonial tapestries. At the center of the table lay 3 items: Rowe's report, the tutor's statement, the access override log. Silence reigned as advisors studied timestamps. Why suppress alert notification? One counselor asked quietly. Possibly prevent corridor disturbance during instruction. Another offered, or a third voice replied, to prevent documentation. The room did not respond immediately, because implication at that level required precision. No accusation was spoken, but doubt had entered the architecture. Back in the administrative corridor, Rowe remained under temporary suspension. Not punitive, but procedural. He surrendered his ceremonial key. He retained his oath. Outside the palace gates, the world remained unaware. Tourists photographed stone lions. Journalists speculated about diplomatic visits. Flags moved gently in wind. Institutions rarely fracture loudly. They adjust internally. By late afternoon, internal security uncovered another irregularity. The privacy override had not only suppressed corridor alerts, it had also disabled interior audio recording for a 12-minute window. Standard procedure required all instructional sessions involving minors to maintain passive audio archive for safeguarding transparency. 12 minutes were missing. Not corrupted, not damaged, removed. The technician leaned back slowly. Deletion required deliberate action, and deliberate action required intent. At 1800 hours, Deputy Marshal Hallberg requested private audience with Captain Merrow. Your sergeant's instincts, Hallberg began carefully, may have prevented something larger than breach of decorum. Merrow's expression remained disciplined. He also fractured command alignment. Perhaps, Hallberg replied, command alignment required fracturing. The words lingered, because inside any institution, there exists a threshold, the moment where preservation of image threatens preservation of principle. Princess Charlotte's schedule for the following week was discreetly amended. Additional safeguarding officer assigned. Rotational oversight expanded. The tutor was placed on temporary administrative leave pending routine pedagogical review. No announcement issued. No public acknowledgement given. The palace continued. But internally, something was recalibrating. That evening, Rose stood alone in the courtyard. No uniform, no ceremony. Just stone and dusk. He had not been commended. He had not been condemned. He existed in suspension. And in that suspension, uncertainty lingered. Because if the override had required Tier 4 authorization, then someone of immense rank had either permitted irregular privacy or been unaware of it. Both possibilities were destabilizing. Inside the palace archives, analysts cross-referenced the override signature against credential holders. Only 3 individuals possessed active Tier 4 access that evening. One was abroad. One was in public attendance at a state dinner. The third had been recorded inside the palace, but not in the eastern wing. According to official logs that could now no longer be considered absolute, at 21:40 the following night, precisely 24 hours after the scream, the Rosewood corridor stood guarded by 2 officers instead of 1. Redundancy implemented quietly. Captain Merrill walked the corridor himself. He paused before the Rosewood door, hand resting briefly on polished oak. Not in doubt, in calculation. Because the issue was no longer whether Sergeant Rowe had acted rashly. It was whether the institution itself had allowed conditions where a child's plea required intervention from below. And that question reached higher than any single guard. Late into the evening, a sealed envelope was delivered to Household Council. Inside, a preliminary finding. The privacy override had originated from a secondary terminal, not the primary chamber console, meaning it had been applied remotely, which meant the individual responsible had not been physically present when the override engaged. A ghost authorization, precise, intentional, and too sophisticated to be accidental. The council chamber fell into deeper silence. Because the palace had long operated on an unspoken understanding, authority flowed downward, accountability flowed upward, but this breach disrupted both directions. Rowe returned home that night under quiet escort. Not detained, not dismissed. He removed his jacket slowly. His daughter ran to him, unaware of institutional tremors. He knelt, holding her longer than usual, because duty to the crown had never felt as complex as it did now. Behind gilded walls, investigation widened. Files cross-checked. Access trails reconstructed. Surveillance redundancies reactivated. The monarchy of Avamere had weathered wars. But internal doubt was different. It did not attack from outside. It questioned from within. And somewhere inside encrypted logs and suppressed alerts lay a decision made by someone confident no one would intervene. But someone had. And that singular act had forced light into spaces accustomed to shade. The palace did not tremble. It adjusted. 2 days after the breach, the eastern wing resumed ceremonial rhythm. Courtiers passed with measured composure. Footmen aligned silver trays with mathematical symmetry. The Rosewood antechamber stood sealed under quiet review, its brass handle polished, its hinges oiled, as if refinement alone could erase what had happened within. But beneath that polish, fault lines had begun to form. Sergeant Elias Rowe remained under administrative suspension, not confined, not disgraced, simply paused. In institutions of power, pause can be more destabilizing than punishment. He reported each morning to a secondary command office overlooking the inner courtyard, a stone enclosure where the national flag rose and fell with unwavering punctuality. He was instructed to wait, to remain available, to refrain from independent inquiry. He obeyed, but obedience now felt heavier because the investigation had moved beyond his action. It had moved upward. Inside the palace's secure operations chamber, a room without windows, buried behind archival vaults. Internal security reconstructed the 12-minute audio gap from the night of the incident. Technicians did not attempt to recover deleted sound. That would have been impossible without archival redundancy. Instead, they mapped silence. When recording ceased, when it resumed, which systems were affected, which were not. The override had been surgical. It had muted interior recording inside the Rosewood antechamber, and only that chamber. Corridor audio remained active, hallway surveillance intact, external guard microphones functional. Whoever applied the override had understood the system intimately, not just rank, knowledge. Deputy Marshal Hallberg stood behind the analyst, hands clasped behind his back. Cross-reference credential proximity, he instructed quietly. The screen populated with names. 3 Tier 4 access holders had system authority that evening. 1 abroad, 1 publicly documented at a diplomatic reception, verified through independent broadcast footage. The third, registered in the palace. But system logs placed their personal terminal in the western residential wing, not near Rosewood, which raised the question, was the override applied from their terminal, or through their credentials? Silence filled the operations chamber, because credential misuse implied something worse than misconduct. It implied trust exploited. Meanwhile, tension brewed within the Guard itself. The Royal Guard of Avamere was not merely ceremonial. It was an elite protection unit bound by oath older than constitutional reform. Discipline was its spine, hierarchy its bloodstream, and Roe had disrupted both. Whispers began, not malicious, but uncertain. Some called him reckless. Others called him necessary. In the Guard's private mess hall, conversation shortened when he entered, not out of rejection, out of caution. Captain Marrow summoned him privately on the third morning. The captain's office overlooked the same corridor Roe had breached. Intentional positioning. Marrow did not immediately sit. You understand, he began evenly, that your action has escalated beyond your intent. Roe remained standing. Yes, sir. You believed you were protecting a child. Yes, sir. And in doing so, you may have exposed fractures within command structure. Roe did not respond, because that had never been his aim. Marrow stepped closer to the window, gaze fixed on the eastern wing. Within institutions like ours, he continued, loyalty is not blind, but it is structured. If structure collapses, chaos replaces it. With respect, sir, Roe said carefully, structure that silences distress is not stability. The words lingered. Heavy, not insubordinate, but dangerous. Marrow turned slowly. You are not wrong, he admitted quietly. But you are not alone in this structure. That was the heart of it. When one guard moved outside formation, others felt the tremor. Later that afternoon, internal security requested Roe's presence again. This time, not a question as breach, but to clarify sensory detail. Describe the tone, Hallberg asked. Roe closed his eyes briefly. Not resistance, he said. Fear, interrupted speech. Breath compression between syllables. You are certain? Yes. Could it have been exaggerated? No. Hallberg studied him. You have children? Yes. Then you are familiar with that distinction. Yes. Hallberg nodded once. Because professional instinct matters, but parental instinct can sharpen it. Meanwhile, a deeper discovery surfaced. System engineers identified that the privacy override had not only suppressed audio recording, it had initiated a secondary encryption mask over internal metadata. In simpler terms, the system had attempted to hide the fact that recording was hidden, that required expertise beyond ceremonial privilege. It required technical fluency. A name emerged quietly within encrypted review channels. Lord Adrian Vaylor, Senior Household Comptroller, Tier 4 clearance. Oversight authority on palace internal systems. Present in the palace that evening. Officially, reviewing budget allocation in the Western Wing. Unofficially, unverified for 12 minutes. Vaylor was not military. He was administrative aristocracy, refined, controlled, deeply embedded within institutional infrastructure. To implicate him required precision. To accuse him without proof would fracture the monarchy's administrative spine. And so the investigation tightened without public ripple. That evening, Princess Charlotte met with the royal physician again. Her arm showed fading discoloration. Emotional evaluation documented mild anxiety. Nothing permanent. But when asked what happened inside Rosewood, she hesitated. He was angry, she said quietly. Who? The physician asked gently. She did not answer directly. Am I in trouble? She whispered instead. The physician wrote carefully. Subject expresses fear of consequence for disclosure. Back in the guard's command corridor, discipline strained subtly. One junior officer approached Roe privately. You did what some of us would not have, he said. That is not praise, Roe replied. No, the officer agreed. It is acknowledgement. Because within rigid hierarchy, conscience can feel isolating. On the fifth evening, Deputy Marshal Hallberg requested confidential audience with Captain Marrow. Evidence suggests deliberate override, Hallberg said plainly, possibly tied to Comptroller Vaylor. Merrill's expression hardened. That is an extraordinary implication. Yes. And proof. Circumstantial, but converging. Merrill exhaled slowly. You understand the political weight of that name. Yes. And the instability that accusation could create. Yes. Hallberg met his gaze. And the instability if we ignore it. Silence. Heavy. Measured. That night. A restricted security recording surfaced, not from the Rosewood chamber, but from a secondary corridor adjacent to the operations terminal. At 21:33 hours, 1 minute before the override, Lord Vaylor entering. Alone. At 21:46, exiting. Calm. Unhurried. 12 minutes. The same 12 minutes erased from Rosewood. The evidence was not explosive. It was quiet, which made it more dangerous. Because quiet evidence demands deliberate action. By morning, Vaylor had been discreetly summoned for internal inquiry. No accusation issued, just clarification requested. He arrived composed, silver hair immaculate, voice measured. I oversee system architecture, he stated calmly. Override protocols fall under my administrative authority. Were you aware of an override applied to Rosewood at 21:34 hours? Hallberg asked. Vaylor's expression did not shift. I authorized temporary privacy. Did you suppress audio recording? I authorized protection from external interruption. Recording suppression was not standard within that authorization. A pause. Thin. I acted in the interest of discretion, Vaylor replied. Discretion for whom? Hallberg asked quietly. Vaylor did not answer immediately. And in that hesitation, hierarchy faltered. Because discretion, when misapplied, becomes concealment. Outside the inquiry chamber, Rose stood in the courtyard once more. He did not know the depth of evidence. He did not know the names circulating above his rank. He only knew that something in that room had required interruption, and that the cost of that interruption was still unfolding. Within the guard, loyalty now divided along invisible lines. Not rebellion, not insubordination, but question. If high rank could suppress safeguarding systems, then what was discipline protecting? The palace that evening felt different. Not chaotic, not loud, but aware. Awareness is destabilizing the institutions built on assumption. Princess Charlotte Protection Detail was doubled quietly. The tutor's clearance permanently revoked. No announcement, no spectacle, but correction. Yet the larger question remained. If override authority had been misused once, could it be misused again? Captain Merrill convened his officers privately that night, their expressions stern, dignified, silent. History does not record private deliberation. It records outcomes. And the outcome here would define precedent. Meanwhile, in a secured annex of the palace, Lord Adrian Vaylor awaited further inquiry. He had not been detained. He had not been publicly reprimanded. But his access credentials had been revoked. For a man whose authority flowed through invisible systems, codes, authorizations, administrative levers, revocation was isolation. When summoned before the extended council, Vaylor entered with composed restraint. He bowed formally. Your Majesty, you authorize a privacy override, the sovereign stated, not accusing, confirming. Yes. You suppressed audio recording. I exercise discretion to prevent misinterpretation of corrective instruction. The chamber remained still. Discretion, the sovereign repeated slowly, does not supersede safeguarding. Vaylor's jaw tightened slightly. Public scandal over minor instructional discipline would damage this institution disproportionately. An internal concealment would not. Hallberg asked evenly. Vaylor did not answer immediately. Because concealment had always existed in monarchy, not as deception, but as filtration. Institutions of this magnitude cannot expose every internal misstep without destabilizing trust. But there is a difference between filtration and erasure. The sovereign leaned forward slightly. Did you witness harm beyond appropriate instruction? No. Did you believe the princess in distress? Vaylor hesitated. A flicker. She was resistant. That was not the question. Silence. Yes, he admitted quietly. She was distressed. And you suppressed record. I suppressed amplification. The words hung in the chamber. Amplification. An administrative euphemism for exposure. Outside the council chamber, Captain Marrow stood with hands clasped behind his back. He had been summoned not for testimony, but for presence. The guard's discipline anchored perception. Inside, the debate deepened. Public trust. One advisor said cautiously, rests not on perfection but on accountability. And accountability, another countered, must be proportional. The sovereign closed the file slowly. This institution, they said evenly, exists to serve. If we silence the stress within our walls to preserve dignity, we forfeit the dignity we claim. No voice rose in objection, because beneath ceremony, that principle was foundational. Princess Charlotte, meanwhile, sat in a smaller drawing room with her governess. A new safeguarding officer stood discreetly outside the door. Her routine had been restored. Lessons rescheduled, public appearances postponed. But children absorb tension, even when adults cure it calm. "Will he come back?" she asked softly. "No," the governess replied gently. "Am I in trouble?" "No." The repetition of reassurance revealed its necessity. Back in the council chamber, the path forward narrowed. Option 1. Quiet internal reprimand. Administrative reassignment. No public disclosure. Option 2. Formal acknowledgement of safeguarding breach. Transparent procedural reform. Public trust tested. The monarchy's survival depended on measured exposure. But suppression, now documented, risked future fracture. The sovereign rose. "Your loyalty," he said, voice controlled but firm, "is not to individuals. It is to the crown's integrity." He paused. Integrity includes protection of those within its care. His gaze briefly met Rose. Not condemnation. Recognition. Because sometimes leadership evolves not through policy, but through confrontation. Late that night, internal security completed its preliminary report. Conclusion: deliberate misuse of tier for override authority. Intent to suppress safeguarding record. Action inconsistent with child protection protocol. Recommendation: immediate internal disciplinary review at highest level. The monarchy stood at a crossroads. Expose and risk destabilization, or contain and risk corrosion. Roe returned home that evening without uniform. He stood in his daughter's doorway as she slept, breathing steady, unaware of the institutional tremor her father had helped ignite. He understood now that his breach had not divided duty from obedience. It had divided duty from hierarchy, and that division would not resolve quietly. Because when conscience moves upward through rank, those at the top must decide whether to silence it or answer it. The palace did not panic. It convened. Behind carved oak doors in the sovereign's council chamber, a room insulated not only by stone, but by precedent. Senior members of the royal household gathered beneath a ceiling painted with allegories of justice and restraint. No press, no staff beyond essential clerks, no ceremonial regalia. Only consequence. Outside, the monarchy continued its choreography. Flags rose. Visitors toured the forecourt. Diplomatic briefings proceeded as scheduled. Stability, after all, was performance as much as principle. But within the council chamber, the air carried weight. On the long walnut table lay 3 documents: the internal security preliminary report, the medical assessment of Princess Charlotte, the override authorization trail bearing Lord Adrian Vaylor's credentials. No one spoke immediately, because within institutions like Avamere, silence is not absence of thought. It is calculation. The sovereign sat ahead of the table, composed, measured, accustomed to absorbing storms without visible tremor. This report suggests the sovereign began evenly, that safeguarding protocols were intentionally suppressed. Deputy Marshal Hallberg inclined his head. "Yes, Your Majesty." And that suppression occurred in proximity to a child under state protection. Yes. The words did not echo. They settled. Lord Vaylor had not yet been formally accused, only administratively suspended pending internal review. But suspension at that level was not trivial. It was tectonic. The monarchy of Avamere had survived by balancing 2 imperatives. Preserve the institution. Protect the innocent. Usually those objectives aligned. Now they strained against one another. If this becomes public, one counselor observed carefully, the narrative will not be measured. It will not distinguish between irregularity and malice. It will become indictment. And if it remains private, another asked, then reform must be absolute. Hallberg replied quietly, or we become complicit. The sovereign's gaze moved to physician's report. Minor physical impact, elevated emotional distress, fear of consequence for disclosure. That final notation lingered. Fear of consequence. Within a monarchy built on continuity, fear of consequence can metastasize quickly. Was there intent to harm? The sovereign asked. Hallberg answered carefully. Intent to suppress record is confirmed. Intent regarding physical correction remains under investigation. The distinction mattered legally, but morally it felt insufficient. The camera drifts across the chamber walls. Portraits of ancestors who weathered wars, abdications, and constitutional reforms. Decision had crystallized. Lord Vaylor, they said calmly, your service to this institution has been substantial. Vaylor inclined his head. But service does not grant exemption from accountability. A pause. You will resign your post effective immediately. The reason will be cited as administrative restructuring. Vaylor's composure faltered, barely perceptible. And the matter, he asked carefully, safeguarding protocols will be publicly reinforced. The sovereign continued. Internal oversight expanded. Audio suppression authority revoked from individual discretion. Transparency but measured. Reform without spectacle. The monarchy would not announce scandal, but it would signal correction. Vaylor bowed again, not disgraced publicly, but removed from influence. The chamber remained still long after he exited, because decisions like this echo beyond personnel. They reshape culture. Captain Merrill was summoned next. Your sergeant, the sovereign said, acted against protocol. Yes, your majesty. And in doing so, prevented further concealment. Yes, discipline must be maintained. Yes, but so must conscience. Merrill understood the balance required. Rowe would not be publicly commended, nor punished. He would be reassigned, discreetly elevated to a safeguarding oversight unit newly established within the Guard. Not reward, responsibility. Because courage, if acknowledged too loudly, can destabilize hierarchy. But if buried, it corrodes morale. By evening, internal memoranda circulated quietly, safeguarding audio systems updated. Dual authentication reinstated universally. Tier 4 override restructured under collective authorization. No press release mentioned the Rosewood antechamber, but palace insiders understood the shift. The corridor itself was reopened under reinforced protocol. 2 guards posted permanently. Redundancy institutionalized. Rowe was summoned one final time before Merrow. You are reassigned, the captain said evenly. Sir, to Oversight Division. Effective immediately. Rowe absorbed the words. Is that punishment? No. Is it reward? No. It is necessity. Rowe nodded once. Because sometimes the greatest acknowledgement is responsibility. That night, the palace stood serene under moonlight, stone walls steady. Flags lowered, but beneath the quiet exterior, something profound had shifted. Not revolution, not collapse, correction. The sovereign remained alone in the council chamber long after others departed. They looked up at the painted ceiling. Justice holding scales. Power balanced by restraint. The weight of the crown is not its jewels. It is its decisions. And tonight, that weight had pressed heavily, but it had not crushed. The palace corridors had regained their disciplined rhythm. Marble floors reflected the morning light, without a ripple of disturbance. Servants moved quietly. Courtiers whispered only when necessary, and the rosewood antechamber remained sealed, orderly once more, its brass handle polished, its history reset to normal. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet acknowledgement lingered. Discipline and conscience had intersected, and the institution now recognized the fragile balance between obedience and moral duty. Sergeant Elias Rowe had been reassigned, not as punishment, not as reward, but with authority in the newly established Oversight Division, responsible for safeguarding protocols across the palace. A silent testament. Courage could coexist with order. The Guard had always been measured. Every movement, every posture, every word, calibrated to centuries of precedent. But now, that calculation included judgment, when to follow and when to act despite hierarchy. Rowe's new assignment required both restraint and vigilance. His colleagues understood without discussion. Acknowledgement required no applause. Inside the council chamber, senior advisors reviewed reforms quietly. Dual authentication for all Tier 4 systems had been implemented. Privacy overrides could no longer be exercised individually. The Palace systems now incorporated redundancy checks and cross-authorizations. Small steps, but decisive. The institution signaled, protection of the vulnerable takes precedence over rank. Princess Charlotte's routine stabilized under reinforced safeguarding. Her lessons continued, her schedule balanced carefully with emotional support. No further incidents were recorded. Medical evaluations confirmed physical recovery. Psychological assessments noted gradual emotional resilience. Subtle, consistent care had replaced uncertainty with structure. Captain Merrill observed the courtyard as Rowe conducted daily inspections. Boots fell in sync with marble seams. Hands remained steady, eyes alert. The guard moved with calm authority, now carrying an understanding that courage and protocol could coexist. Observers might not see the quiet acknowledgement, but the institution itself had felt it. Even Lord Vaylor's removal was executed with dignity. Administrative restructuring avoided scandal, yet underscored accountability. No public announcement highlighted the breach, preserving trust in the monarchy, while internally affirming that power carries responsibility. It was subtle, deliberate, and effective. In the Rosewood corridor, silence returned. The walls bore no scars from the incident. Chandeliers hung in perfect symmetry. Marble gleamed. And yet, those who passed through, guards, courtiers, advisors, felt a weightless awareness of lessons learned. Protocol was intact. Conscience had been preserved. Balance had been restored. At day's end, Rowe returned to his quarters. He removed ceremonial attire carefully, placing his uniform in order. He paused by the window, watching the palace gates under dusklight. The corridors were quiet. Children's laughter echoed faintly from distant playrooms. The air felt settled, though memories of tension lingered as a reminder. The guard reflected on the events quietly. There had been no spectacle, no dramatic announcement, just a measured moral resolution that preserved both dignity and duty. Hierarchy remained, authority remained, but the silent understanding prevailed. Safeguarding innocence can outweigh obedience to rank when the two come into conflict. The Rosewood corridor remained functional, observed, and protected. Its officers knew the story, though no record was public. And in that quiet, the palace had reaffirmed its enduring principle. Honor comes before hierarchy. The corridors were silent now, not merely empty of sound, but attuned to memory. Marble floors retained the faintest imprint of boots. Gilded frames seemed heavier, as though the events of recent days had added weight to their watchful eyes. Chandeliers reflected a softer light, casting long shadows that moved slowly, deliberately, like the conscience of the palace itself. Sergeant Elias Rowe walked the eastern wing alone, unhurried. His boots whispered across the marble, footsteps measured, precise, deliberate. He paused at the rosewood antechamber. The door gleamed under the ambient light, brass polished, hinges oil-slicked, walls untouched by chaos. The chamber had resumed its function. Lessons continued. Life within the palace moved forward. Yet the echo of what had transpired remained. Rowe's reflection was not on scandal, nor on authority, nor even on the senior household members whose actions had necessitated intervention. His thoughts were inward, resting on the duality of duty and conscience. A soldier obeys orders. A guard preserves structure. But the quiet truth, the invisible burden, is that sometimes protection demands action outside the lines. He thought of the child, her trust fragile but steadfast, despite the incomprehensible pressures of life behind gilded walls. She represented innocence preserved against centuries of ritual, protocol, and hierarchy, and he represented conscience within the discipline of obedience. Together, they had tested the boundaries of power and morality without ever questioning the institution itself. The palace itself seemed to breathe around him. Corridors remembered. Tapestries absorbed the weight of choices. Portraits regarded without judgment, yet acknowledged the courage required to act. echoes of Scream lingered not as trauma, but as a reminder that vigilance, moral clarity, and courage could coexist alongside centuries of tradition. Outside, the sun dipped behind stone towers, casting elongated shadows across the courtyard. Guards shifted positions, ceremonial and unbroken, yet aware in subtle ways of the recalibration of principle that had occurred within the walls. Each step, each posture, carried forward a silent understanding. That legacy is preserved not only by authority, but by those who act when authority fails to protect. Roe paused near the central atrium, eyes tracing the pathways through which the young princess moved each day. The corridors, once symbols of order alone, now carried layered significance, a place where tradition and conscience intersect. Every door, every brass handle, every polished floor tile now bore invisible testimony to courage exercised quietly, deliberately, morally. He reflected on the truth of institutions. They survive not by silence alone, but by the conscience that moves within them. When rules demand stillness and hierarchy insists on inaction, those willing to act become the true stewards of stability. History, he knew, remembers not the order preserved, but the courage that preserved it. The palace remained serene. Evening shadows stretched and softened. Windows caught the fading light, reflecting golden streaks across corridors, reminding all who walked them that responsibility exists both in action and restraint. Roe's reflection lingered on the delicate balance between tradition and conscience, permanence and impermanence, authority and duty. And as he turned from the corridor, leaving the rosewood antechamber behind, the echo of those days remained, a quiet reminder that legacy is not measured in stone or in protocol or in rank. It is measured in courage exercised when rules demand stillness and conscience demands action.